Saladin, the Sultan who changed history. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Saladin, a name that has echoed through the centuries as one of the most remarkable figures in medieval history. Born in a time of great turmoil and transformation, this Kurdish warrior would rise from relatively modest beginnings to become the Sultan who united the Muslim world and reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders. But beyond the battles and the conquests, Saladin's story is one of complex humanity. A man remembered by both his allies and his enemies for his wisdom, his mercy, and his unwavering dedication to his faith and his people. As we journey through his life tonight, we will explore not just the military campaigns and political maneuverings that defined his era, but also the personal qualities that made him legendary. We will walk through the dusty streets of 12th century Damascus, stand on the windswept heights overlooking Jerusalem, and witness the clash of civilizations that shaped the medieval world. This is a story of faith and warfare, of diplomacy and conquest, of a man who became a symbol of chivalry even to his Christian adversaries. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us travel back more than 800 years to a world of crusaders and Saracens, of fortified cities and desert strongholds, to discover the life of the man known to history as Saladin, the world into which he was born. To understand Saladin, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The year 1138, when he drew his first breath, was a time when the Near East stood at a crossroads of cultures and conflicts. The great Islamic civilization that had flourished for centuries was fragmenting into competing dynasties and regional powers, while European crusaders had carved out precarious kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The city of Tikrit, where Saladin was born, sat on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. It was a strategic location, a gateway between different worlds, and it was here that a Kurdish family of military administrators made their home. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, served as the warden of Tikrit Castle, a position of considerable responsibility and modest prestige. The Ayyubid family, as they would come to be known, traced their ancestry to the Kurdish regions of Armenia and had entered the service of the Seljuk Turkish rulers, who dominated much of the region. The night of Saladin's birth was said to be unremarkable in the historical records, with no portents or omens recorded to suggest the destiny that awaited this child. He was given the name Yusuf, a common name meaning Joseph in Arabic, and the fuller form of his name would become Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, righteousness of the faith, Joseph, son of Ayyub. It was a name that spoke to the religious devotion of his family, and one that he would make legendary. But the tranquility of his early childhood would not last long. When Saladin was still an infant, his father became embroiled in a dispute with the local governor. The details of this conflict are lost to the mists of time, but the consequences were clear. The family was forced to flee Tikrit, abandoning their home and seeking refuge elsewhere. They traveled north to Mosul, then under the control of the powerful Zengid dynasty, and there they found new opportunities in the service of Imad ad-Din Zengi, a formidable military commander who had ambitions of uniting the Muslim territories against the Crusader states. This displacement, this early experience of political turbulence and the need to adapt to new circumstances, may have planted the first seeds of the diplomatic flexibility and strategic thinking that would characterize Saladin's later career. The young boy grew up in a household where military service and political loyalty were paramount, where discussions of war and statecraft were part of daily life, and where the fragmented state of the Muslim world was a constant source of concern and conversation. A youth in Damascus, the family's fortunes improved when they relocated to Damascus. the ancient city that had been a center of civilization since time immemorial. Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, had distinguished himself in military service and had risen to prominence in the court of Nur ad-Din, the son of Zengi, who had inherited his father's territories and ambitions. Through this connection, the Ayyubid family found security and opportunity in the bustling metropolis of Damascus. For young Saladin, Damascus must have been a revelation. The city was a tapestry of cultures, languages, and traditions. Its markets overflowed with goods from across the known world: silks from China, spices from India, glassware crafted by local artisans renowned throughout the Mediterranean. The Great Mosque rose majestically in the heart of the city, its minarets calling the faithful to prayer 5 times each day, its courtyards filled with scholars debating theology and philosophy. It was in Damascus that Saladin received his education. Like other young men of his class, he studied the Quran and Islamic law, mathematics and literature, the arts of warfare and horsemanship. Medieval Islamic education emphasized memorization and mastery of classical texts, and Saladin proved to be a diligent, if not exceptional, student. His teachers noted his serious demeanor and his deep religious conviction, qualities that would serve him throughout his life. But the young man showed little initial enthusiasm for a military career. Contemporary sources suggest that in his youth, Saladin was more inclined toward religious scholarship and contemplation than toward the clash of arms. He was described as somewhat withdrawn, preferring prayer and study to the rough camaraderie of military camps. His father and uncle, both career soldiers, must have wondered whether this introspective young man possessed the steel necessary for the brutal world of medieval warfare. Yet circumstances have a way of drawing out hidden qualities in people, and Saladin's destiny would not allow him to remain a scholar in Damascus. His uncle Shirkuh was a warrior of considerable reputation, a man of action who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. When Nur ad-Din began planning campaigns into Egypt, Shirkuh would be chosen to lead the expeditions, and he would bring his nephew along, whether Saladin wished it or not. The relationship between Saladin and his uncle was complex. Shirkuh was gruff and battle-hardened, a man who had spent his life in military camps and on campaign. He saw potential in his nephew that perhaps even Saladin did not see in himself. The historical chronicles tell us that Saladin initially resisted accompanying his uncle to Egypt, that he wept at the prospect of leaving the comfortable life of Damascus for the uncertainties of war. But family duty was sacred, and when Shirkuh insisted, Saladin had no choice but to comply. This reluctance is worth noting, for it reveals something important about the man Saladin would become. He was not driven by personal ambition or a love of warfare for its own sake. Rather, he would prove to be a man who saw military action as a necessary tool for achieving religious and political objectives, not as an end in itself. This perspective would later inform his strategic decisions and his reputation for mercy and restraint in an age not known for either quality. The Egyptian campaign's Egypt in the 1160s was a prize of immense value and a source of great concern for the Muslim rulers of Syria. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, was in terminal decline. The caliph had become little more than a figurehead, while various viziers and military commanders vied for actual power. The kingdom was wealthy beyond measure, fed by the endless fertility of the Nile River, but it was also weak and vulnerable. This vulnerability attracted multiple predators. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, always hungry for resources and territory, saw an opportunity to expand southward and perhaps gain control of Egypt's riches. At the same time, Nur ad-Din in Damascus recognized that Egypt could not be allowed to fall into Crusader hands, and that whoever controlled Egypt would command resources sufficient to change the balance of power in the entire region. Shirkuh led 3 campaigns into Egypt between 1164 and 1169, and Saladin accompanied his uncle on all of them. These expeditions were not simple matters of conquest, but complex political and military operations requiring careful navigation of shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, and the constant threat of Crusader intervention. The first campaign, in 1164, was a response to an invitation from Shawar, the Fatimid vizier who had been ousted from power and sought help to regain his position. Shirkuh's forces marched into Egypt and succeeded in restoring Shawar to the vizierate. But rather than showing gratitude, Shawar immediately turned against his benefactors, fearing that Shirkuh intended to remain in Egypt and seize power for himself. The Syrian forces found themselves besieged in Bilbais, a city in the Nile Delta, and it was here that Saladin first experienced the desperation of combat and siege warfare. The sources tell us that Saladin distinguished himself during this difficult campaign, showing courage and capable leadership that surprised those who had known him as the bookish young man from Damascus. When the situation became untenable, Shirkuh negotiated a withdrawal, and the Syrian forces returned home. But the experience had transformed Saladin. He had discovered in himself a capacity for military leadership, and perhaps more importantly, he had seen firsthand the complexity of the political situation in Egypt and the opportunities it presented. The second campaign came in 1167, again prompted by the unstable situation in Egypt. This time, Shirkuh's forces penetrated deeper into the country, and the young Saladin was given independent command of a portion of the army. At Alexandria, the ancient port city that had once been home to the great library and the lighthouse that was one of the 7 wonders of the world, Saladin was left in command of the garrison while his uncle went to deal with other threats. The Crusaders and the forces of the Fatimid vizier laid siege to Alexandria, and for months Saladin held the city. It was a crucible that tested everything he had learned about leadership, about inspiring men to hold firm in desperate circumstances, about managing limited resources and maintaining morale when hope seemed distant. The citizens of Alexandria, impressed by his just administration and his courage, would remember him fondly for the rest of his life. Eventually, as with the first campaign, Shirkuh was forced to negotiate a withdrawal. But each expedition had taught Saladin more about Egypt, its politics, its geography, its people, and its possibilities. He was learning the arts of war and statecraft, not from books, but from hard experience, and he was proving himself capable in ways that surprised even himself. The rise to power. The third campaign into Egypt, which began in late 1168, would change everything. The Crusader king Amalric of Jerusalem had decided to launch a full-scale invasion of Egypt, breaking treaties and attacking without provocation. The Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, desperately called for help from Nur ad-Din, and once again Shirkuh was dispatched with an army to defend Egypt from the Frankish invaders. This time, Saladin was not a reluctant participant, but an experienced commander, his uncle's right hand in the campaign. The Syrian forces marched quickly through the winter months, racing to reach Egypt before the Crusaders could consolidate their conquests. When they arrived, they found Amalric's forces besieging Cairo itself, and a complex 3-way struggle ensued between the Crusaders, the Syrian army, and the forces still loyal to the Fatimid vizier. The political situation was extraordinarily delicate. The Fatimid Caliph still commanded religious loyalty from many Egyptians, and the Fatimid dynasty followed Shia Islam, while Nur ad-Din and his representatives were Sunni Muslims. The theological divide between Sunni and Shia Islam was significant, and many in Egypt viewed the Syrians with suspicion, despite the common threat posed by the Christian crusaders. Shirkuh proved to be a brilliant military tactician. He outmaneuvered the crusaders, cut their supply lines, and eventually forced them to withdraw from Egypt entirely. With the Frankish threat eliminated, at least temporarily, Shirkuh's position in Egypt became supreme. The vizier Shawar, who had proven himself treacherous in the past, was eliminated, and Shirkuh himself was appointed vizier of Egypt by the grateful caliph. But Shirkuh would not enjoy his triumph for long. On March 23, 1169, just 2 months after becoming the most powerful man in Egypt, Shirkuh died suddenly. The historical sources attribute his death to natural causes, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, conditions that medieval medicine could neither predict nor prevent. Whatever the cause, his death created a vacuum of power at a critical moment. The question of succession was not simple. Shirkuh had been a formidable warrior whose reputation commanded respect and fear. Who could replace him? Various commanders in the Syrian army had their own ambitions, and the Fatimid Caliph had his own preferences. But in the complex calculations of power that followed, the choice fell upon Saladin. He was 31 years old, younger than many of the other commanders, and he had entered Egypt as his uncle's subordinate rather than as a leader in his own right. Why was he chosen? The reasons were likely multiple. He had proven his military competence and his administrative ability. He was from the Ayyubid family, which gave him legitimacy as Shirkuh's successor. He was intelligent and diplomatic, qualities that would be needed to navigate the treacherous political waters of Egypt. And perhaps most importantly, he may have seemed less threatening to the various factions than a more established commander would have been. He could be seen as a compromise candidate, someone who could unite different interests. On March 26, 1169, just 3 days after his uncle's death, Saladin was appointed vizier of Egypt. It was a position of immense power and equally immense danger. He was now responsible for governing one of the richest countries in the world, maintaining the loyalty of an army far from home, managing the relationship with the Fatimid Caliph, and answering to his overlord Nur ad-Din in Damascus. Any mistake could prove fatal, and there were many who would be happy to see him fail. Consolidating control in Egypt. The first years of Saladin's rule in Egypt were fraught with challenges and uncertainties. He was vizier, but the Fatimid Caliph still held religious authority, and there were many in Egypt who resented the presence of Syrian troops and administrators. Various factions plotted against him, and he faced multiple attempts to overthrow or assassinate him. One of the earliest and most serious threats came from within the palace itself. The Fatimid Caliph's chief eunuch, a man of considerable influence named Mu'tamin al-Khilafa, organized a conspiracy to murder Saladin and restore full Fatimid control. The plot involved the complicity of the caliph's household troops and had the tacit approval of the young caliph himself. But Saladin's intelligence network discovered the conspiracy before it could be executed, and he moved swiftly to neutralize the threat. The eunuch was arrested and executed, and the palace guard was disbanded and replaced with troops loyal to Saladin. Another challenge came from the remnants of the old Fatimid military establishment. Many Egyptian officers and soldiers resented being subordinated to Syrian commanders, and in August 1169, a group of them rose in rebellion, seizing control of a portion of Cairo. The revolt was put down with considerable bloodshed, and Saladin used the opportunity to further consolidate his control over the military apparatus of Egypt. Perhaps the most dangerous external threat came from a joint Crusader-Byzantine invasion in the autumn of 1169. King Amalric of Jerusalem had forged an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus, and together they launched a massive assault on the port city of Damietta, which controlled access to the Nile Delta. A Byzantine fleet of hundreds of ships appeared off the coast, while Amalric's army marched overland to join the siege. Saladin responded to this crisis with a combination of military action and strategic patience. He reinforced Damietta's defenses and ensured that the garrison there could hold out against the siege. Meanwhile, he understood that time was on his side. The Crusader-Byzantine alliance was uneasy, both sides suspicious of each other's ultimate intentions. The Byzantine fleet had arrived at the beginning of winter, when storms made the Mediterranean dangerous for large fleets, and the besiegers were far from their bases of supply, operating in hostile territory. As weeks turned into months, disease and privation took their toll on the besiegers. The alliance between Crusaders and Byzantines frayed under the strain of failed assaults and mounting casualties. Finally, in December 1169, the siege was abandoned, and the invasion force withdrew in disorder. It was a tremendous victory for Saladin, achieved not through a single decisive battle but through patient strategic defense and an understanding of his enemy's vulnerabilities. These early crises taught Saladin valuable lessons about power and survival. He learned to maintain an extensive intelligence network, to move decisively against threats before they could fully develop, and to balance ruthlessness when necessary, with mercy and reconciliation when possible. He also recognized that his position in Egypt, while strong, was not yet secure. He was still formally the subordinate of Nur ad-Din in Damascus, and the Fatimid Caliph still commanded religious loyalty from many Egyptians. The relationship with Nur ad-Din was particularly delicate. Nur ad-Din had sent Shirkuh to Egypt to prevent it from falling into Crusader hands and to extend his own influence over the wealthy kingdom. Now Saladin, nominally Nur ad-Din's vassal, controlled Egypt's resources and armies. Nur ad-Din sent periodic messages demanding that Saladin send more of Egypt's wealth to Damascus, and there were tensions over how independent Saladin should be in his governance of Egypt. Saladin navigated this relationship carefully. He sent tribute to Damascus regularly, affirming his loyalty to Nur ad-Din. He consulted with his overlord on major decisions and presented himself as a faithful servant rather than an independent ruler. Yet at the same time, he was quietly consolidating his control over Egypt, appointing his family members and trusted associates to key positions, building up the military forces under his command, and establishing the administrative structures that would allow him to govern effectively. The question of the Fatimid Caliphate also loomed large. The Fatimid dynasty was Shia Muslim, while Nur ad-Din was a Sunni Muslim committed to orthodox Sunni doctrine. The existence of a rival caliph in Egypt, even one largely powerless, was an affront to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Nur ad-Din expected Saladin to eliminate the Fatimid Caliphate and restore nominal allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph, thereby bringing Egypt back into the Sunni fold. But Saladin moved cautiously on this sensitive issue. Many Egyptians were deeply attached to the Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled them for 2 centuries. Moving too quickly against the caliph could trigger widespread revolt. Instead, Saladin waited, gradually marginalizing the caliph's authority while presenting himself as the real power in Egypt. He began to mint coins in the name of the Abbasid Caliph, a symbolic assertion that Egypt now recognized Baghdad's religious authority rather than Cairo's. The end came in September 1171, when the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid fell ill and died. He was only 21 years old, having lived his entire reign as little more than a puppet of stronger men. With his death, Saladin did not appoint a successor. Instead, he declared Egypt's return to Sunni Islam and its allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. It was a momentous decision, ending 2 centuries of Fatimid rule and fundamentally changing the religious character of Egypt. The transition was managed so carefully that there was remarkably little unrest. Saladin had prepared the ground well, ensuring that key factions were either co-opted or neutralized before making his move. Within a few years, the Fatimid Caliphate would be remembered as a piece of history, and Egypt would be firmly established as part of the Sunni Muslim world. Building an independent power base. With the Fatimid Caliphate eliminated and his control over Egypt secure, Saladin began to transform the country's military and administrative systems. He understood that Egypt's great wealth, properly harnessed, could make him one of the most powerful rulers in the Muslim world. But he also knew that this wealth had to be deployed carefully to build a military force capable of challenging the Crusader states and to create an administrative system that could support sustained military operations. The Egyptian army was reformed and expanded. Saladin relied heavily on Kurdish troops from his own tribal background, as well as on Turkish mounted warriors who formed the elite cavalry that was the dominant military force of the era. He also recruited from among the local Egyptian population, particularly for garrison duty and naval forces. The army he built was professional, well-trained, and loyal to him personally, rather than to any abstract concept of state or dynasty. Naval power also received attention. The Mediterranean was dominated by Italian merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which generally maintained good relations with the Crusader states. To challenge Crusader control of the coast, Saladin needed a fleet, and he invested considerable resources in building up Egypt's naval capabilities. Shipyards in Alexandria and other ports were expanded, and crews were recruited and trained. The administrative reorganization of Egypt was equally important. Saladin introduced the Iqta system more systematically, whereby military commanders and administrators were granted the right to collect taxes from specific territories in exchange for providing military service. This system, similar to European feudalism in some respects, allowed Saladin to maintain a large standing army without emptying the treasury. It also bound his commanders to him through mutual interest. Their prosperity depended on his success. Agricultural production was encouraged, with attention paid to maintaining Egypt's vital irrigation systems and ensuring that the annual flooding of the Nile could be properly utilized. Trade was promoted, with Egypt serving as a crucial link between the Mediterranean world and the trade routes stretching to India and beyond. The taxes generated from this trade enriched the treasury and provided resources for Saladin's military ambitions. But even as Saladin was building his power in Egypt, his relationship with Nur ad-Din was becoming increasingly strained. From Damascus, Nur ad-Din watched with growing concern as his former subordinate became ever more independent. He sent increasingly insistent demands that Saladin launch campaigns against the Crusader states, that he send more revenue to Damascus, that he recognize more clearly Nur ad-Din's supreme authority. Saladin walked a careful line. He launched limited campaigns into Crusader territory, enough to show that he was engaged in the jihad against the Christians, but not so extensive that he would weaken his position in Egypt. He sent money to Damascus, but always less than Nur ad-Din demanded. He wrote respectful letters affirming his loyalty, while acting with increasing independence in practice. The historical sources suggest that by 1173, the relationship had deteriorated significantly. Nur ad-Din began planning a campaign to Egypt, ostensibly to join forces with Saladin for a major assault on the Crusader states, but perhaps also to bring his wayward vassal back under direct control. Saladin reportedly prepared to resist, fortifying positions and preparing to defend Egypt if necessary. A confrontation between the two most powerful Muslim rulers of the age seemed inevitable. But then, in May 1174, Nur ad-Din died suddenly in Damascus. He was only 57 years old, still vigorous and at the height of his power. His death removed the one man who had the legitimacy and the power to challenge Saladin's independence. The heir to Nur ad-Din's territories was his young son, Al-Salih Ismail, who was only 11 years old. Regents and military commanders immediately began competing for control in Damascus, and the unity that Nur ad-Din had imposed on Syria began to fragment. Saladin saw his opportunity. He had spent 5 years consolidating control over Egypt, building an army and establishing his reputation. Now, with Nur ad-Din's death, the path was open for him to expand his authority beyond Egypt into Syria itself. He would present himself as the protector of Nur ad-Din's young son, as the champion of Muslim unity against the Crusaders, as the rightful heir to Nur ad-Din's legacy. In October 1174, Saladin marched out of Egypt at the head of a large army. He was no longer merely the vizier of Egypt or the subordinate of any Syrian ruler. He was becoming an independent power, a sultan in his own right, ready to claim leadership of the Muslim resistance to the Crusades. The conquest of Syria. The march from Cairo to Damascus in the autumn of 1174 was the beginning of a new chapter in Saladin's life. He was now 46 years old, no longer young but still energetic and ambitious. The army he led was battle-hardened and loyal, enriched by the wealth of Egypt and confident in their commander's abilities. But the conquest of Syria would prove to be no simple matter. Damascus, the city where Saladin had spent much of his youth, was now divided between competing factions. Some saw in Saladin a legitimate heir to Nur ad-Din's vision of Muslim unity. Others viewed him as an upstart, a former subordinate who was using Nur ad-Din's death as an opportunity to seize power for himself. When Saladin arrived at the gates of Damascus with his army, the city's leaders had to make a choice. After some negotiation and perhaps some implied threats, Damascus opened its gates to Saladin in November 1174. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, promising to maintain order, respect property rights, and continue the policies of Nur ad-Din. The young Al-Salih Ismail was allowed to remain in Aleppo with a portion of his inheritance, and Saladin presented himself as the boy's protector rather than his usurper. But not everyone accepted Saladin's authority. The powerful city of Aleppo in northern Syria refused to recognize him. Aleppo had been the seat of Nur ad-Din's power before he had moved to Damascus, and its rulers saw themselves as the rightful heirs to his legacy. For them, Saladin was an Egyptian interloper, a Kurd who had taken advantage of Nur ad-Din's death to seize power. What followed was years of sporadic warfare and complex diplomacy as Saladin worked to bring all of Syria under his control. It was a frustrating period, for Saladin found himself fighting not against the Crusaders, whom he saw as the true enemy, but against fellow Muslims who should have been his allies in the struggle against the Christian kingdoms. He laid siege to Aleppo in late 1174, but the city proved too strong to take quickly. The defenders appealed for help to various powers, including the Assassins, a secretive Shia sect based in mountain fortresses in Syria and known for their political murders. In 1175, while Saladin was campaigning near Aleppo, assassins from the sect attempted to kill him. They infiltrated his camp and nearly succeeded in their mission, wounding Saladin before being killed by his guards. The assassination attempt was a wake-up call. Saladin realized that he had many enemies, not just among the Crusaders, but also among various Muslim factions, who saw him as a threat to their own power and interests. He increased his personal security, always traveling with a guard of trusted soldiers, and he began to wear armor even in his tent at night. The struggle for control of Syria consumed much of the 1170s. Saladin fought battles against the rulers of Aleppo and Mosul, besieged cities, and negotiated constantly shifting alliances. He faced opposition from the Zengid princes, who had been Nur ad-Din's relatives, and who believed they had a better claim to his inheritance than Saladin did. And all the while, the Crusader states watched and occasionally intervened, playing Muslim factions against each other to maintain their own security. One of Saladin's key strategies during this period was to present himself as the champion of jihad, the holy war against the Crusaders. He argued that Muslim disunity was the greatest gift to the enemies of Islam, that the squabbling princes of Syria were betraying the legacy of Nur ad-Din, who had devoted his life to fighting the Christians. Saladin claimed that he sought power not for himself, but to unite the Muslims and drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land. This propaganda was effective, particularly among religious scholars and the common people who were weary of constant warfare between Muslim rulers. Gradually, Saladin built a reputation as a pious Muslim leader devoted to the cause of Islam. He was careful to observe religious law, to support scholars and religious institutions, and to present his campaigns as serving a higher purpose rather than mere personal ambition. The turning point came in 1183 when Al-Salih Ismail, the young son of Nur ad-Din, died. With his death, the last rival claim to Nur ad-Din's legacy disappeared. Saladin was now the undisputed master of both Egypt and Syria. He had spent nearly a decade consolidating this position, fighting more battles against fellow Muslims than against Crusaders, but now he was ready to turn his full attention to what he saw as his primary mission: the recapture of Jerusalem and the elimination of the Crusader states. The Crusader kingdoms. To understand Saladin's great campaigns of the 1180s, we must understand the nature of the Crusader states he faced. These Latin kingdoms were fragile creations, carved out of Muslim territory nearly a century before by European knights who had answered Pope Urban II's call to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. By Saladin's time, the Crusader states consisted of 4 main territories: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa, which had already been reconquered by Nur ad-Din. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the most important and symbolically significant of these states, as it included the Holy City itself. These kingdoms were military colonies, always dependent on a steady flow of reinforcements from Europe to maintain their existence. The Crusader population was small, probably never more than a few 100,000, vastly outnumbered by the Muslim and Eastern Christian populations they ruled. Their strength lay in their fortifications, massive stone castles that dotted the landscape, and in their heavy cavalry, armored knights whose charges could break enemy lines on the battlefield. But the Crusader states had inherent weaknesses. They were perpetually short of manpower, which meant that every battle carried existential risk. A single defeat could destroy an army that might take years to replace. They were also divided among themselves, with various nobles and religious orders pursuing their own interests, rather than presenting a united front. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, in particular, was riven by factionalism and succession disputes in the 1170s and 1180s. The King of Jerusalem during this period was Baldwin IV, known to history as the Leper King. He had been diagnosed with leprosy as a child, a devastating illness in the medieval world. Medieval leprosy, likely Hansen's disease, was progressive and debilitating, causing skin lesions, nerve damage, and eventually disfigurement and disability. That Baldwin the More managed to rule at all, let alone to rule effectively for over a decade, was a testament to his courage and determination. Baldwin IV was a constant thorn in Saladin's side during the 1170s. Despite his illness, the young king was an capable military commander who won several notable victories against Saladin's forces. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, Baldwin IV, though seriously ill, led his knights in a devastating charge against Saladin's army, routing the Muslim forces and nearly capturing Saladin himself. It was one of the worst defeats Saladin ever suffered, and it demonstrated that the Crusaders remained formidable opponents. But Baldwin's condition continued to deteriorate. By the early 1180s, he was largely bedridden, his body ravaged by disease. The kingdom was increasingly paralyzed by disputes over who would succeed him and who would hold power during his illness. Various factions competed for influence, and the unity that might have allowed the Crusaders to resist Saladin was absent. One of the key figures in this period was Reynald of Châtillon, the lord of the fortress of Kerak, which controlled the vital caravan routes between Damascus and Egypt. Reynald was everything that Saladin was not: reckless, violent, and heedless of treaties or diplomatic niceties. He launched raids against Muslim caravans and even threatened to attack Mecca itself, the holiest city in Islam. His actions enraged Muslims throughout the region and gave Saladin a valuable propaganda tool, portraying the Crusaders as barbarous enemies of Islam who recognized no bounds of civilized conduct. Saladin declared that Reynald must be punished for his attacks on Muslim pilgrims and his threats against the holy cities. It became personal for Saladin, and he swore that if he ever captured Reynald, he would execute him with his own hands. This vow, made publicly, would later have significant consequences. By 1185, Baldwin IV was dead, succeeded briefly by his young nephew Baldwin V, who died within a year. The throne then passed to Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister, and her husband Guy of Lusignan became king. Guy was widely regarded as weak and indecisive, a man who had been elevated to the throne more through political maneuvering than through any personal merit. His elevation was controversial, and several leading nobles refused to acknowledge his authority. Saladin watched these developments with satisfaction. The Crusader states were clearly divided and weakening, their leadership uncertain, and their military resources stretched thin. After years of consolidating his power over Egypt and Syria, he now commanded vast resources: the wealth of Egypt, the manpower of Syria, and the religious authority that came from being recognized as the champion of jihad. The time was approaching for a decisive confrontation. The road to Hattin. The year 1187 began with an uneasy truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Both sides had been exhausted by years of raiding and counter-raiding, and a temporary peace allowed both to rebuild their forces. But Reynald of Châtillon, true to his nature, refused to respect the truce. In late 1186, he attacked a large Muslim caravan traveling between Cairo and Damascus, slaughtering the guards and taking the merchants prisoner along with all their goods. This attack was the provocation Saladin had been waiting for. He sent messengers to King Guy, demanding that Reynald return the prisoners and the goods taken from the caravan. When Guy proved unable or unwilling to compel Reynald to comply, the Lord of Kerak essentially thumbed his nose at his king. Saladin had the justification he needed for war. In the spring of 1187, Saladin began assembling his forces. He sent out a call for warriors from across his territories, from Egypt and Syria, from the Kurdish highlands and the Arab tribes. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of cavalry and tens of thousands of infantry mustered to his banner. Religious scholars issued proclamations declaring this campaign a jihad, and volunteers flocked to join, motivated by faith and the promise of rewards, both spiritual and material. The army that gathered was the largest Saladin had ever commanded. Modern historians estimate it may have numbered as many as 30,000 warriors, though exact figures are impossible to determine with certainty. It was a formidable host, but it was also an army that needed to move quickly and strike decisively, for such a large force consumed enormous quantities of food and water, and the longer the campaign lasted, the more difficult supply would become. Saladin's strategy was to draw the Crusader army out of their fortresses and defeat them in open battle. He knew that the Crusaders were strongest when fighting from behind stone walls, but in the field, his superior numbers and the mobility of his cavalry could be decisive. The challenge was to create a situation that would force the Crusaders to fight on his terms. In late June 1187, Saladin's army crossed the Jordan River and marched into Galilee. On July the 2nd, he laid siege to the city of Tiberias, which sat on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The city fell quickly, but the citadel held out, defended by Esheva of Bourez, the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader nobles. The fall of Tiberias and the peril of Raymond's wife created exactly the crisis Saladin had hoped for. The Crusader leadership gathered at Safaria, about 20 miles west of Tiberias, to decide their response. They had managed to assemble nearly the entire military strength of the kingdom, perhaps 20,000 infantry and about 1,200 knights, the latter being the elite heavy cavalry that was the Crusaders' main striking force. A heated debate ensued in the Crusader camp. Raymond of Tripoli, despite the fact that his wife was besieged in Tiberias, argued against marching to her relief. He knew Saladin's strategy and understood that the Muslim leader wanted to draw the Crusaders out into the open. Raymond argued that the army should stay at Safaria, where there was abundant water and a strong defensive position, and force Saladin to either assault them there or withdraw when his supplies ran low. But others, particularly Reynald of Châtillon and Gerard of Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, accused Raymond of cowardice and argued that honor demanded they march to the relief of Tiberias. King Guy, weak and indecisive, wavered. Finally, swayed by appeals to honor and duty, he gave the order to march. It was a decision that would doom the Crusader kingdom. The Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army set out from Safaria on the morning of July 3, 1187. It was already hot, the beginning of a scorching summer day, and the soldiers were heavily burdened with armor and weapons. The route to Tiberias led through dry, barren hills, with little water available along the way. Saladin had ensured that the wells were poisoned or filled in, and his light cavalry harassed the Crusaders constantly, shooting arrows and then withdrawing before the knights could engage them. The march became a nightmare. The heat was oppressive, the dust choking, and the men were tormented by thirst. Muslim archers, mobile and elusive, inflicted a constant stream of casualties. The Crusader army was strung out in a long column, unable to properly defend itself against the hit-and-run attacks. By the afternoon, it was clear that they would not reach Tiberias before nightfall. King Guy called a halt near a village called Hattin, named for the distinctive double-peaked hill that rose above it, known as the Horns of Hattin. It was a terrible place to camp, no water, no good defensive position, and surrounded by Saladin's forces. But the army was exhausted and could march no farther. The soldiers spent a miserable night, tormented by thirst, while the Muslims set fire to the dry grass around them, the smoke adding to their suffering. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader position completely. All night long, drums beat in the Muslim camp, and men chanted prayers and verses from the Quran. It was psychological warfare, designed to demoralize the enemy, and it was effective. The Crusader soldiers, already suffering from thirst and exhaustion, listened to the sounds of the vast army that encircled them and contemplated the morning that was to come. At dawn on July 4th, Saladin launched his assault. The Crusader army tried to break out, to fight their way to water and safety, but they were too weak and too disorganized. The infantry, suffering terribly from thirst, broke ranks and tried to reach the horns of Hattin, hoping to find some defensive position. They were cut off and surrounded, many surrendering when promised water. The knights, the elite of the Crusader army, made several desperate charges, trying to break through the Muslim lines. For a time, their heavy armor and discipline allowed them to carve through Saladin's forces, but each charge left them more exhausted and no closer to escape. The Muslim cavalry would part before their charges and then reform, surrounding the knights and cutting them off from any support. By mid-morning, the battle was decided. King Guy's tent had been overrun, and the true cross, the holy relic believed to be part of the actual cross on which Jesus Christ had been crucified, and the most sacred object in the kingdom of Jerusalem, had been captured. This was a devastating psychological blow, for the true cross was believed to ensure divine favor in battle. Its capture signaled to all that God had abandoned the Crusaders. King Guy, along with most of the surviving nobles, was captured. Reynald of Châtillon was among the prisoners. The battlefield was covered with the dead and dying, and thousands of Crusader soldiers were taken prisoner. It was one of the most complete military victories in medieval history, and it had been achieved not through a single climactic clash, but through superior strategy. Saladin had manipulated his enemies into fighting in conditions where all their advantages were nullified and all their weaknesses were exposed. The aftermath of the battle was sobering. Saladin had his tent pitched on the battlefield, and the prisoners were brought before him. He received King Guy and the nobles courteously, offering them cool drinks and treating them, according to the customs of medieval warfare, as honored prisoners who would eventually be ransomed. But when Reynald of Châtillon was brought forward, Saladin's demeanor changed. He reminded Reynald of his attacks on Muslim caravans, his threats against Mecca, his violations of treaties and truces. He offered Reynald one last chance to convert to Islam and save his life, as was customary. When Reynald refused, Saladin drew his sword and personally struck him down, fulfilling the vow he had made years before. The killing of Reynald was a calculated act. It sent a message that Saladin would not tolerate those who violated the laws of war and threatened Muslim holy places, but it also demonstrated his restraint. He executed only Reynald, not the other nobles who were technically equally his enemies. King Guy, who had feared he would share Reynald's fate, was assured that kings do not kill kings, and was treated well in captivity. The ordinary soldiers and knights who had been captured faced a different fate. Those who were wealthy enough to afford ransom were held for payment. Those who could not pay were sold into slavery. The members of the military orders, the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, were singled out for execution, for Saladin regarded these warrior monks as the most dangerous and implacable of his enemies. Hundreds were beheaded in the days following the battle. The Battle of Hattin had destroyed the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a single day. The kingdom's army, painfully assembled over decades, had been annihilated. The castles and cities that remained were garrisoned by skeleton crews, unable to mount any effective resistance. The road to Jerusalem was open, the reconquest of Palestine. In the weeks following Hattin, Saladin's armies swept through the Crusader territories like a flood. Cities and castles that had been held by the Christians for nearly a century surrendered one after another. The garrisons were too weak to resist, and when they saw Saladin's vast army approaching, many negotiated surrender terms rather than face a siege. Acre, the great port city that was the economic heart of the Crusader kingdom, surrendered on July 10th, just 6 days after Hattin. Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, the coastal cities that had been the Crusaders' connection to Europe, fell in quick succession. The great castles of the interior, including Reynald's fortress of Kerak, were besieged and taken. By the end of the summer, almost the entire kingdom of Jerusalem was in Saladin's hands. Only 2 major cities remained in Crusader control: Tyre, defended by Conrad of Montferrat, a capable Italian nobleman who had arrived just in time to organize a successful defense, and Jerusalem itself. Tyre, with its strong fortifications and access to the sea, could hold out indefinitely and would indeed remain a Crusader stronghold. But Jerusalem, though protected by massive walls, was vulnerable. Saladin arrived before the walls of Jerusalem on September 20th, 1187. The city was crowded with refugees from across the kingdom, all seeking sanctuary behind its walls. But there were few soldiers to defend them. Most of the kingdom's fighting men had died at Hattin or were prisoners. The defense was organized by Balian of Ibelin, a capable knight who had escaped from Hattin and had been released from his oath to Saladin on the condition that he spend only 1 night in Jerusalem to rescue his family. But when Balian saw the desperate situation in the city, he felt duty-bound to remain and organize the defense, breaking his oath, a decision that Saladin, though it complicated his siege, reportedly understood and accepted as the honorable choice. Jerusalem was perhaps the most significant city in the world for 3 great religions. For Christians, it was the city where Jesus had been crucified and resurrected, the holiest site in their faith. For Jews, it was the site of the ancient temple, the center of their religious life for 1,000 years before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. For Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the 3rd holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina, the site from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven on his night journey. The city had been captured by the First Crusade in 1099, and the conduct of the Crusaders on that occasion had been horrific. They had massacred much of the Muslim and Jewish population, killing thousands of men, women, and children in an orgy of violence that shocked even the medieval world. The great mosque of Al-Aqsa had been turned into a church, and the Islamic holy sites had been desecrated. This history hung over the siege of 1187. Everyone wondered whether Saladin would exact revenge for the slaughter of 1099. The siege began with a series of assaults on the walls. Saladin's engineers set up siege engines, and his archers kept up a constant bombardment. Mining operations began, with sappers digging tunnels under the walls to weaken the foundations. The defenders fought back courageously, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, and everyone knew that the city could not hold out for long. After about 2 weeks of siege, on September 29th, Balian came out to negotiate the surrender of the city. The meeting between Balian and Saladin was, according to the historical chronicles, one of the dramatic moments of the Crusades. Balian explained that the situation in Jerusalem was desperate, that there was no hope of relief, and that continued resistance would only lead to greater suffering. But he also made a threat. If Saladin refused to offer reasonable terms, the defenders would destroy the city's holy sites, kill the Muslim prisoners being held in Jerusalem, and then sally out to die fighting, taking as many of Saladin's soldiers with them as possible. It was a credible threat, and Saladin listened. He proposed terms for the peaceful surrender of Jerusalem. The Christians would be allowed to leave the city unharmed if they paid a ransom: 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child. Those who could not pay would become slaves. Balian protested that many of the refugees in the city were poor and could never afford such ransom. But Saladin held firm on the principle, though he did make some concessions. On October 2, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem were opened, and Saladin's forces entered the city peacefully. What followed was remarkable. There was no massacre, no mass enslavement, no orgy of revenge for 1099. Saladin, mindful of his reputation and guided by Islamic law, which mandated humane treatment of defeated enemies who had surrendered peacefully, kept tight control over his forces. Many Christians were able to pay their ransom and left the city, carrying their possessions and heading for the coast to find passage to Europe. For those who could not pay, Saladin's brother Al-Adil purchased the freedom of thousands using his own money. Saladin himself freed many others. In the end, while some Christians were indeed sold into slavery, the vast majority were allowed to leave unmolested. The Islamic holy sites were restored. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred Christian site in Jerusalem, was not destroyed or desecrated, but was left intact, though Christian worship there was restricted. Saladin invited Jews, who had been banned from Jerusalem during the Crusader period, to return to the city. He ordered that the Al-Aqsa Mosque be cleansed and reconsecrated for Muslim worship. The conduct of Saladin's army in Jerusalem was the source of his greatest fame in the West. Christian chroniclers, even while mourning the loss of the Holy City, praised Saladin's mercy and his adherence to the laws of warfare. The contrast with the massacre of 1099 was stark and deliberate. Saladin had demonstrated that Muslim armies could be more merciful and civilized than Christian ones. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Pope Urban III was said to have died of grief when he heard the news, and his successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City. The Third Crusade, which would bring some of the greatest warriors of Europe to the Holy Land, was beginning to take shape. The Third Crusade news of the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe in late 1187, and the reaction was one of shock, grief, and anger. The Pope's call for a new crusade found an immediate response. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, who would become known as Richard the Lionheart. Saladin spent the winter of 1187–88 consolidating his conquests. He continued to reduce the remaining Crusader castles, and by the spring of 1188, only Tyre remained in Christian hands in the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. He also began to prepare for the inevitable European counterattack. He knew that the loss of Jerusalem would bring a massive crusading army, and he fortified key positions, stockpiled supplies, and ensured that his forces were ready for a long conflict. The first of the crusading monarchs to depart was Frederick Barbarossa, who led a large German army overland through Anatolia. This was a dangerous route, through hostile Muslim-controlled territory, but Frederick was an experienced campaigner, and his army made good progress. Saladin prepared to face what promised to be a formidable foe. But then disaster struck. In June 1190, while crossing a river in Anatolia, Frederick drowned. His death was a catastrophe for the crusade. The German army, demoralized and leaderless, largely disintegrated, with only a small portion reaching the Holy Land. Meanwhile, Richard of England and Philip of France, who had been bitter rivals, agreed to cooperate for the crusade. They traveled by sea, their fleets meeting in Sicily before sailing on to the Holy Land. Richard, in particular, was emerging as a warrior of formidable reputation. He was brave, energetic, an excellent tactician, and utterly devoted to the military arts. He was also arrogant, hot-tempered, and politically maladroit, qualities that would complicate his crusade. The Crusaders' target was Acre, the great port city that Saladin had captured after Hattin. The city had been under siege by a Crusader army since August 1189, but the besiegers had been unable to take the city, and Saladin had been unable to drive them away. The situation had stalemated, with both sides suffering terribly. When Richard and Philip arrived, with their armies in 1191, the balance shifted decisively in the Crusaders' favor. The siege of Acre was a brutal affair. Saladin tried repeatedly to relieve the city, launching attacks on the Crusader siege lines, but Richard's arrival had brought fresh troops and renewed energy. The city's defenses were pounded by siege engines, and the garrison was slowly starved into submission. Finally, on July 12, 1191, after a siege of nearly 2 years, Acre surrendered. The terms of surrender specified that the garrison would be spared if Saladin paid a large ransom, released Christian prisoners, and returned the true cross captured at Hattin. But when Saladin delayed in paying the ransom, Richard made a brutal decision. On August 20, 1191, he ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children, in full view of Saladin's army. It was a massacre that shocked contemporaries on both sides and stained Richard's reputation. Saladin's response was measured but firm. He ordered the execution of Christian prisoners in his custody in retaliation. The chivalry that had characterized the early interactions between Saladin and his Crusader opponents was giving way to a harder, more brutal conflict. Richard then led his army south along the coast toward Jaffa, planning to use it as a base for an advance on Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed the Crusader army, looking for an opportunity to attack. That opportunity came at Arsuf, where on September 7, 1191, the two armies fought a major battle. The Battle of Arsuf was a tactical victory for Richard. Saladin's forces attacked the Crusader column as it marched along the coast, and for hours the fighting raged. Richard kept his army tightly organized, refusing to let his knights charge until the right moment. When he finally unleashed them, the impact was devastating. The Muslim forces were driven back with heavy casualties, but the victory at Arsuf did not end the war. Richard advanced to Jaffa and fortified it, then moved inland, rebuilding castles and strongholds as he went. In January 1192, he marched to within 12 miles of Jerusalem, close enough to see the city's walls. But then he hesitated. Jerusalem was a formidable target. Its walls were strong, and Saladin had had years to prepare its defenses. Moreover, even if Richard could take the city, holding it would be extremely difficult. The Crusader kingdom's infrastructure had been destroyed, and maintaining supply lines to a garrison in Jerusalem would be a constant challenge. Finally, Richard knew that he could not remain in the Holy Land indefinitely. Problems in England and his French territories demanded his attention. After days of deliberation, Richard made the painful decision to withdraw without attempting to retake Jerusalem. It was perhaps the wisest military decision of the crusade, but it was politically and emotionally devastating. The whole purpose of the crusade had been to reclaim Jerusalem, and to come so close and then turn back was bitter. The Lion and the Sultan. The relationship between Richard and Saladin during the Third Crusade was complex and would become the stuff of legend. The two men never actually met face to face. Medieval warfare rarely provided opportunities for such dramatic encounters. But they communicated through messengers, exchanged gifts, and developed what might be called a grudging mutual respect. Richard sent messages proposing various diplomatic solutions. At one point, he even suggested a marriage alliance. His sister Joanna would marry Saladin's brother Aladil, and together they would rule a combined Christian-Muslim kingdom. The proposal was fantastical and never seriously pursued, but it showed Richard's willingness to think creatively about how to end the conflict. Saladin, for his part, recognized that Richard was the most dangerous opponent he had faced. The English king was fearless in battle, an inspiring leader, and tactically brilliant. But Saladin also saw Richard's weaknesses, his impetuosity, his tendency to make enemies even among his own allies. Philip II had returned to France after the fall of Acre, partly due to disputes with Richard, and his political problems back home. The war continued through 1192 with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Richard won battles and captured cities, but he could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not drive the Crusaders into the sea, but he could maintain his control of the interior. Both sides were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their armies worn down by combat and disease. In July 1192, Richard fell seriously ill, possibly with scurvy or another disease common among crusading armies. Saladin, hearing of his enemy's illness, reportedly sent his personal physician to treat Richard, along with fresh fruit and snow from Mount Hermon to cool his fever. When Richard recovered, he sent gifts of thanks to Saladin. These gestures, while not common, exemplified the strange mixture of bitter warfare and chivalric respect that characterized their relationship. The final crisis of the crusade came in August 1192, when Saladin launched an unexpected attack on Jaffa, capturing the city. Richard, who was at Acre, immediately sailed south with a small force. In a dramatic scene, he waded ashore and led the defense of the citadel, which had not yet fallen. With just a handful of knights and a few hundred soldiers, Richard held off Saladin's army until reinforcements could arrive. A few days later, Saladin launched a surprise dawn attack on Richard's camp outside Jaffa. Richard, according to the chronicles, wasn't even wearing armor when the alarm was raised. But he rallied his forces and repelled the attack in what was perhaps his finest moment of the crusade. Outnumbered and surprised, he nonetheless defeated Saladin's assault through sheer courage and tactical skill. But both Richard and Saladin knew that the war could not continue indefinitely. Richard received urgent messages from England. His brother John was plotting to seize the throne, and his French territories were under threat. Saladin's resources were depleted, and his emirs were weary of constant campaigning. In September 1192, the two sides agreed to a 3-year truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, as it came to be known, was a compromise that left neither side fully satisfied, but acknowledged the realities of the military situation. The Crusaders would retain a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, but Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit the holy city unmolested. It was, in effect, an agreement to disagree. Both sides would have to live with an imperfect solution because neither could impose their will militarily. Richard departed the Holy Land on October 9, 1192, never to return. His crusade had been a military success in many ways. He had recaptured much of the coast and had proven himself in battle against the legendary Saladin. But he had failed in his primary objective of retaking Jerusalem. His journey home would be marked by further misfortune. He would be captured in Austria and held for ransom for over a year before finally returning to England. For Saladin, the end of the crusade was a relief but not a triumph. He had maintained control of Jerusalem and the interior, which was a significant achievement. But the coastal cities in Crusader hands were a constant source of concern and a potential base for future crusades. Moreover, the years of constant warfare had taken their toll on him personally. The final years. When Richard departed in October 1192, Saladin was 54 years old, an advanced age by medieval standards. He was exhausted from nearly 25 years of nearly constant military campaigning. His health, which had always been good, was beginning to fail. He suffered from recurring fevers and other ailments, and those close to him noticed that he had lost weight and seemed perpetually tired. Yet he could not rest. The responsibilities of ruling a vast empire stretched from Egypt to northern Syria, of maintaining the unity he had so painstakingly constructed, of ensuring that his family and supporters were provided for. All of these demanded his attention. He returned to Damascus in early November 1192, to the city where he had spent his youth and which had become his capital. The sources tell us that Saladin spent these final months attending to administrative matters, settling disputes, and distributing rewards to his loyal followers. He was known for his generosity, perhaps too much so, as his personal treasury was often nearly empty because he gave so freely to those who served him and to the poor. When he died, it was said that he did not have enough money left to pay for his own funeral. He also spent time with his family. Saladin had married several times and had fathered 17 sons, along with an unknown number of daughters. His sons were now young men, and the question of succession loomed large. Medieval succession was never simple, and Saladin had not designated a clear heir. His eldest son, Al-Afdal, was governor of Damascus and the presumptive successor. But Saladin had other sons who also had claims and ambitions. In February 1193, Saladin rode out of Damascus to greet a caravan of pilgrims returning from Mecca. It was a ceremonial duty, and also an act of piety. Saladin had immense respect for those who made the pilgrimage to Islam's holiest city. But the weather was cold and wet, and Saladin, whose health was already fragile, caught a chill. The illness that followed was probably a fever, possibly yellow fever or malaria, though exact diagnosis is impossible across the centuries. He took to his bed, and physicians were called. For several days they tried various treatments, but nothing helped. The fever grew worse, and Saladin began to drift in and out of consciousness. On March 3, 1193, with his sons and close advisors gathered around his bedside, verses from the Quran were recited. When the readers reached the passage, "He is God, than whom there is no other deity, the knowing of the unseen and the seen," Saladin smiled, and a few moments later, he died. He was 55 years old. The grief in Damascus was genuine and profound. Saladin had been more than just a ruler. He had been seen as a protector of Islam, a unifier of the Muslim peoples, and a man of personal virtue in an age not known for virtue in its leaders. The funeral was attended by thousands, and the contemporary chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote that men wept openly in the streets. Legacy and memory. Saladin was buried in a mausoleum adjacent to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, a relatively simple tomb for a man who had ruled one of the largest empires in the Muslim world. When the tomb was opened in modern times, it was found to contain 2 coffins, one a relatively plain wooden coffin in which Saladin's body had been originally placed, and another, more ornate coffin added later. Both coffins were inscribed with verses from the Quran emphasizing the transitory nature of worldly power. The empire Saladin had built did not long survive him intact. His sons and relatives immediately began competing for control of different parts of his territories, and within a few decades, the Ayyubid dynasty he had founded was fragmenting into rival branches. Yet the dynasty he established would rule Egypt for another 60 years and parts of Syria for even longer, providing a degree of stability in a turbulent region. But Saladin's true legacy was not political but symbolic. He became, in both Islamic and Western memory, the exemplar of the righteous warrior, a man who fought for his faith, but who did so with honor, mercy, and justice. In the Muslim world, he was remembered as the liberator of Jerusalem, the unifier of the faithful, and the champion of jihad. Countless streets, institutions, and children have been named after him across the Islamic world. In the West, paradoxically, Saladin's reputation was equally high. Christian chroniclers, even those writing during his lifetime, praised his chivalry and his mercy. He became a figure of romance and admiration in European literature, appearing in Dante's Divine Comedy, where he is placed in limbo among the virtuous non-Christians, in Walter Scott's The Talisman, and in countless other works. For Christians who had lived through the bitterness of the Crusades, Saladin represented the troubling possibility that their enemies could be noble and virtuous. This positive reputation was not accidental, but was carefully cultivated. Saladin understood the power of propaganda and public relations, and throughout his career, he worked to present himself as a just and merciful ruler. The peaceful surrender of Jerusalem, the treatment of prisoners, the gestures of chivalry toward Richard and other enemies. These were not just spontaneous acts of personal virtue, but calculated decisions designed to build a reputation that would serve his political interests. Yet beneath the propaganda, there was genuine substance. Saladin truly was devout in his religious faith, scrupulous in his observance of Islamic law, and personally temperate in his lifestyle. The historical sources, both Muslim and Christian, are remarkably consistent in depicting him as a man of integrity who kept his word and who genuinely cared about justice. In an age of brutal warlords and treacherous politicians, these qualities were exceptional. Saladin's military genius is sometimes questioned by modern historians. He suffered several significant defeats, most notably at Montgisard, and his record in battle was mixed. But his strategic vision was sound. He understood that the key to defeating the Crusader states was unity among the Muslim powers, and he devoted decades to achieving that unity. His greatest military success, the Battle of Hattin, was not won through tactical brilliance alone, but through strategic patience. He waited until the conditions were perfect and then executed a plan that gave him every advantage. His diplomatic skills were equally important. Saladin navigated the complex politics of the medieval Near East with skill, building alliances, neutralizing enemies, and gradually constructing a position of unassailable power. He understood that warfare was only one tool of policy, and that diplomacy, propaganda, and administrative competence were equally important. The man behind the legend. As we reach the end of our journey through Saladin's life, it's worth reflecting on the man behind the legend. What made him who he was? What drove him through decades of nearly constant warfare and political maneuvering? The sources paint a picture of a man who was serious and somewhat austere. He did not drink alcohol, as befitted a devout Muslim. He did not indulge in the luxuries that his position would have afforded him. His personal possessions were modest, and he gave away most of his wealth to his soldiers and to charitable causes. He was known for being accessible to his subjects, regularly holding court where anyone could bring complaints or petitions directly to him. He had a sense of humor, though it was dry and not always apparent to those who didn't know him well. The chronicles record several instances of Saladin making jokes or engaging in witty exchanges with his advisors. He enjoyed poetry, both reading it and occasionally composing verses himself, though he did not consider himself a talented poet. His relationships with his family were complex. He arranged marriages for his relatives to cement political alliances, a common practice in his time. He relied heavily on family members in his administration, appointing brothers, sons, and nephews to key positions. This was both a strength, it ensured loyalty, and a weakness. It sowed the seeds of future dynastic conflict. He could be ruthless when necessary. The execution of Reynald of Châtillon and the massacres of Templar and Hospitaller prisoners after Hattin showed that mercy had its limits. When his authority was challenged, he moved quickly and decisively to eliminate threats. The unity he built in Syria was partly achieved through military force and the intimidation of rivals. Yet he was also capable of genuine compassion. The stories of his generosity to prisoners, his concern for the poor, and his efforts to spare civilian lives in warfare are too numerous and too well attested to be dismissed as mere propaganda. He seems to have genuinely believed in the principles of justice and mercy that Islamic law prescribed, and he tried to live according to those principles even when it was not politically convenient to do so. Above all, Saladin was motivated by faith. His religiosity was not a political pose, but a deep personal conviction. He saw himself as fulfilling a religious duty in fighting the Crusaders, not merely pursuing personal or dynastic ambition. This sense of higher purpose gave him resilience during setbacks and guided his decisions throughout his career. When he showed mercy to defeated enemies or spared civilian lives, he did so not just for propaganda purposes, but because he believed Islamic law required it. This religious motivation had its limits, of course. Saladin was not above using religion for political purposes, and he could be flexible in his interpretation of Islamic law when political necessity demanded it. But compared to many of his contemporaries, both Muslim and Christian, he showed a genuine commitment to living according to religious principles. Saladin, in historical context. To truly understand Saladin, we must see him not in isolation, but as part of the larger historical currents of his age. The 12th century was a pivotal time in world history. The Crusades were bringing European and Near Eastern civilizations into intense contact and conflict. The great Islamic civilization that had flourished for centuries was adapting to new challenges and threats. Trade was expanding, connecting different parts of the world in complex economic networks. New ideas in science, philosophy, and art were emerging from the interaction of cultures. Saladin was in many ways a product of this world. His Kurdish background, his service to Turkish overlords, his rule over Arab populations, his conflicts with European crusaders, all of this reflected the multicultural, multilingual reality of the medieval Near East. He spoke Arabic and Kurdish, possibly some Turkish, and he understood the different cultures and traditions that made up his empire. He was also a transitional figure. The style of warfare he practiced, based on mounted archers and light cavalry, was beginning to give way to new forms of military organization. The political structures he built, personal loyalty reinforced by grants of land and authority, were evolving into more bureaucratic systems. The religious zeal that motivated his campaigns would continue, but future conflicts would increasingly be driven by political and economic concerns, rather than purely religious ones. In the broader sweep of history, Saladin's impact was significant, but not transformative. He did not permanently drive the Crusaders from the Near East. They would maintain footholds for another century. He did not fundamentally change the structure of Islamic society or politics. His dynasty would eventually be replaced by the Mamluks, who would rule Egypt for centuries. But he did accomplish something important. He demonstrated that the Crusader states could be defeated, that Jerusalem could be reclaimed, and that Muslim unity was possible. These achievements had profound psychological and symbolic importance, even if their political impact was limited. He also set a standard for how warfare could be conducted with honor and how enemies could be treated with dignity, a standard that would influence both Islamic and Western traditions of warfare. Reflections on a life. As we come to the end of our exploration of Saladin's life, we're left with a figure who is both historically important and personally intriguing. He was a man who rose from modest beginnings to rule one of the largest empires in the world. He was a warrior who fought for decades, yet was remembered for his mercy. He was a Muslim who became a hero even to his Christian enemies. He was a Kurd who became the champion of Arab and Islamic causes. His life reminds us that history is made by individuals whose actions are shaped by their times, but who also shape those times through their choices. Saladin did not create the Crusades, nor did he create the conditions that made his rise possible. But through his decisions, his leadership, and his character, he changed the course of events in ways that reverberated for generations. The medieval world that Saladin inhabited is far removed from our own in its customs, beliefs, and technologies. Yet the fundamental questions he faced, how to lead justly, how to balance idealism with pragmatism, how to maintain integrity while wielding power, these remain relevant questions today. His life offers no simple answers, but it provides a rich case study in leadership, strategy, and the complex interplay between personal virtue and political necessity. In the centuries since his death, Saladin has been claimed by many different causes and interpreted in many different ways. Arab nationalists have seen him as a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. Islamic activists have invoked his memory to justify jihad. Western writers have used him as a symbol of enlightened opposition to Christian extremism. Romantic historians have emphasized his chivalry and his conflicts with Richard the Lionheart. All of these interpretations capture some aspect of the historical Saladin, but none captures him completely. He was a complex man living in a complex time, and reducing him to a simple symbol does disservice to his memory. He was neither a perfect saint nor a cruel tyrant, neither a brilliant genius nor a mediocre opportunist. He was, like all historical figures, a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, virtues and flaws, achievements and failures. What we can say with confidence is that Saladin left his mark on history. The 12th century would have unfolded very differently without him. Jerusalem might not have been reclaimed for Islam. The Crusader states might have established permanent roots in the Near East. The political map of the region would look different, and the cultural memory of the Crusades, both in the Islamic world and in the West, would have taken different forms. Conclusion: the long shadow of history. As night deepens and we reach the end of our journey through Saladin's life, we can see how his story continues to resonate more than 8 centuries after his death. His tomb in Damascus still receives visitors, both Muslims paying respect to a hero of their faith and historians seeking to understand a pivotal figure in medieval history. The cities he conquered and the battlefields where he fought are still marked by his legacy. But perhaps the most important legacy of Saladin is not found in physical monuments or political boundaries, but in the realm of ideas and memory. He showed that it was possible to be both a successful warrior and a merciful leader, that faith and pragmatism need not be incompatible, that enemies could respect each other even while fighting. These lessons, while not always heeded, have continued to influence how people think about warfare, leadership, and the relationship between different cultures and religions. In our own time, when conflicts between civilizations and religions continue to trouble the world, Saladin's example has particular relevance. Not because he provides simple solutions to complex problems. He doesn't. But because his life demonstrates that even in the midst of bitter conflict, there is room for honor, mercy, and mutual respect. The fact that he could become a hero to both sides of a religious war suggests possibilities for understanding and reconciliation that transcend immediate political and military conflicts. Of course, we should not romanticize Saladin or the age in which he lived. The 12th century was a brutal time, and warfare then, as in all times, brought immense suffering to ordinary people caught in the clash of armies and empires. Saladin's mercy, while notable, had its limits, and many died in his campaigns or suffered under his rule. The Crusades were a tragedy for all involved, leaving wounds that took centuries to heal, and in some ways still have not fully healed. But within that tragic context, Saladin's story offers moments of light, instances where human decency triumphed over the logic of hatred and revenge, where leaders chose mercy over cruelty, where enemies acknowledged each other's humanity. These moments are precious precisely because they were so rare, and they remind us that even in the darkest times, individuals can make choices that elevate the human spirit. As we conclude this long exploration of Saladin's life, perhaps the most important thing to take away is a sense of the complexity of historical figures. Saladin was neither the perfect hero of legend nor the cynical manipulator that modern skeptics sometimes portray. He was a man of his time, shaped by its values and limitations, but also capable of transcending them in moments of moral clarity and courage. His rise from the relatively modest position of a Kurdish military family to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria was remarkable by any standard. The way he navigated the treacherous politics of his age, building alliances and outmaneuvering rivals, demonstrates considerable political skill. His military achievements, particularly the victory at Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem, were significant accomplishments that changed the course of medieval history. But perhaps more than his political and military successes, what has given Saladin his enduring reputation is the moral character he demonstrated. In an age of violence, he showed restraint. In an age of fanaticism, he showed tolerance. In an age of brutality, he showed mercy. These qualities were not weaknesses, but strengths that enhanced his power and secured his legacy. The medieval world that produced Saladin is long gone, swept away by centuries of change. The Crusader kingdoms he fought against disappeared long ago. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded lasted only a few generations. The specific political and military challenges he faced are no longer relevant. Yet his name is still known, his story is still told, and his example is still cited. This endurance is a testament to the power of personal character and moral leadership. Political and military power are fleeting. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms come and go. Great armies are raised and then vanish into the dust of history. But the memory of how power was used, of whether leaders acted with justice and mercy or with cruelty and oppression, this memory endures. Saladin understood this, perhaps intuitively. He knew that reputation mattered, that how he was remembered would be as important as what he accomplished in his lifetime. He cultivated his image as a just ruler and a merciful conqueror, and he generally lived up to that image. It was a remarkable achievement for a man who spent most of his adult life at war. As we leave Saladin now, returning from the 12th century to our own time, we carry with us the story of a remarkable life, a life of struggle and triumph, of warfare and diplomacy, of religious devotion and political pragmatism. It is a life that illuminates a crucial period in world history and that continues to speak to us across the centuries. The lights of Damascus have long since dimmed for Saladin. The battles he fought are distant memories. The empire he built has faded into history. But his name lives on, a bridge between civilizations, a symbol of how conflicts might be conducted with honor, and a reminder that even in the midst of great struggles, there is room for mercy, justice, and human dignity. And so we conclude tonight's journey through the life of Saladin, a man who became a legend, a warrior who became a symbol of peace, and a figure from history who continues to teach us lessons about leadership, faith, and the better angels of our nature. May his example inspire us to seek understanding across differences, to temper strength with mercy, and to remember that the true measure of greatness lies not in what we conquer, but in how we treat those we have the power to destroy. Rest well, and thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's most fascinating figures.